Welcome to Radius of Reason, episode 3, Devon.
What's going on?
Not a whole lot. What are we doing here?
We are pondering the meaning of life.
And the purpose that's derived from work.
Yes.
I cannot imagine a more Protestant topic for episode 3 of Radius of Reason. The Protestant work ethic, baby. It's back.
So how do you define meaning? The meaning of life itself. How do you define that?
Well, as a good American Protestant, I would say the meaning of life itself is to toil, is to labor, is to contribute to the economy, to pay my taxes.
Okay, now the non-delusional definition.
Life has no meaning. We have to generate meaning for ourselves. Everybody has their own definition of it, probably. I imagine some people derive meaning from raising families. Some people derive meaning from playing sports, coaching sports. I don't think it's a universal type of thing. It's a little difficult to answer that question with a blanket term. I think the meaning of life is probably the pursuit of meaning.
Interesting.
What do you think, Levon?
I don't know. We're going to discuss that today. We're going to find out. I don't want to spoil it.
Spoiler alert.
So, do you think we have more or less meaning in our lives than, say, 100 years ago?
I would say that this is something that there are various points of discussion to, especially as people are, I think, collectively discussing this. This is a topic that a lot of people are concerned with and interested in. I think as we've become really conscious of the direction in which our economy has shifted during the pandemic, when we realized that a huge portion of work could be done from home, that in itself already raises questions about, is the work we're doing meaningful? And if we're, as a country, embracing the Protestant work ethic and deriving meaning from work, then is our life now meaningless? So to answer your question, if we look at it from a professional standpoint, I think probably, we have less meaning in life because the work that we're doing is less immediately impactful. Because really, what is the work that we're doing? And for context, I think it's a great point of discussion here because we have Levon, who's a software engineer with a technical background, and me with my soft humanitarian background working in a marketing agency, which they're probably two completely different interpretations of how those two companies derive meaning and bring meaning to the economy. But long-winded answer, I think we have less meaning in our lives now than we did maybe. What was your time parameter?
I said a century ago.
A century? Oh, yeah, definitely. Less meaning.
Okay. And now what about 20, 30, 40, 50,000 years ago?
Yeah, probably less meaning. I think that meaning for a very long time, when we were discussing this off mic, we talked about the animal kingdom, right? And I think I raised the question of what meaning does a raccoon bring? And really, I imagine the raccoon, I'm thinking from the standpoint of a raccoon now, but it's the point of survival, right? I imagine animals derive meaning because they have to survive, they have to find meals, they have to reproduce. And the closer we were to our primal state, I think the meaning, it was easier to answer that question, right? You asked me that question just now, what did I do? I hesitated because it's difficult to find meaning when a lot of the primal bases have been covered. We have food, we have shelter. For all intents and purposes in this country, on this continent, it's a stable source of food and shelter, at least for a percentage of society, which, it's decreasing given the homeless crisis and all of that. But I think in a post-industrial society, meaning is a lot harder to find because we are no longer immediately responsible for food sources. We're not hunting for our food. Oh my gosh, I'm taking the fucking Rogan spin on this. But I think that, yes, we have less direct meaning in our lives now than maybe 50,000 years ago because we actually actively have to find meaning and pursue meaning as opposed to having a primal source for meaning as it is given to us.
Well put.
Now, Levon, what do you think?
Oh, the podcast is over. We're done. We're done.
We covered all the bases.
No, I completely agree. I think, from an evolutionary standpoint, we've evolved to, obtain food, reproduce, find shelter, just survive, period. And that by default gives you tremendous meaning, right? If you're in a small tribe with 50 people, right, back in the day, what is more meaningful than going out on a hunt and bringing a a buffalo back to your tribe, right? Like, you just potentially saved everyone's life, including your own. Like,
right.
What is more meaningful than that? Now, you compare that to what we do today. You go to the office, you open up Microsoft Excel, and then you go home.
Do hard drugs and go to sleep.
Potentially do hard drugs. Or, I mean, everything's a drug, really. I mean, if you think about it, if you're eating chips,
high fructose corn syrup,
and Oreos.
Yeah.
I mean, that is super normal stimuli. That's, in terms of the concentration of fat, sugar, salt, right? So, like, we are constantly drugging ourselves to achieve something.
To say nothing for the dopamine releases we pursue from smartphone usage and social media, pornography,
etc.
And we harp on Joe Rogan a lot when we talk, but I think a lot of his, like, quote unquote, super masculine cooking meat over an open fire, it does kind of embody something that I've been thinking about. And I know we've talked about it before, where, if you look at rates of depression on a global scale, right? Maybe it's just we're talking about it openly now, which is maybe a perk of the level of civilization we're at, where we can openly discuss mental health. And I think our generation's been especially good at that. But let's say rates of depression are higher. Prescriptions of antidepressants are higher, which, again, there may be other, marketing-related reasons for that. But we've kind of lost this connection to the roots of the fact that we are living things. And at one point, we were defined by a pursuit for survival, right? That's why people always say, like, oh, when I go hiking, I always come back feeling so much better, right? You're outdoors, you're breathing, you're walking, you're open in your surroundings and seeing the world around you. But in a kind of in a post-industrial lifestyle, where I remember, especially like during the height of the pandemic, I wouldn't leave my apartment for like days on end, So what kind of meaning is that, right? If I'm sitting in my apartment, I'm doing all of my professional tasks seated over a laptop, I don't move my limbs around. I'm certainly not running away from panthers. So yeah, where's the meaning in that? So maybe that's kind of why we have all these, one mental health crisis after another, and there's clearly something wrong, right?
Yeah, and I do want to highlight something before we get too deep into this. If you look at the work by Steven Pinker, right, in Enlightenment Now, he has a great book, which I have actually in my hand.
We actually have Steven Pinker here with us today.
His soul and his spirit is with us.
Man, that bookmark has not moved at all since last time.
I've moved on to better books. But, I mean, he makes a case, how much there was on meaning, but I think he has data on happiness, and we're actually more happy than we were, say, 100 years ago. And that's because, in terms of work, we have more free time. We work less hours, there's just higher standards in the workplace. In addition to all the, technological advancements that we've had as a society that has eased things for us. So there's a connection to happiness and meaning, but they're not the same thing. And if you look at the data, we are actually happier than we were, at least when you compare us to like, a century or two ago.
Interesting.
Now, does that necessarily... we don't have data for 50,000 years ago. But I imagine, with predators and diseases and, I don't know, just not even having proper shelter, when it gets cold, like, how happy were they? They may have had meaningful lives, but were they happy?
But but this is kind of maybe to catch you on a rhetorical loop. Are you inherently equating meaning with happiness?
No, I'm not.
Interesting.
No, I'm not. I'm trying to make the point that they are in fact different. But it's hard to say that one could be as happy as possible or maximally happy without having a meaningful life, right? So like, to me, it almost puts a stain on your happiness if you don't quite have the meaning in addition to your life, right? you could be, let's say you're a guy and that you're just a sex addict, and then you have sex with all the prettiest women. You could have a very happy life, but when you reflect on it, you can be like, man, like, all I did was sleep with women, and like, yeah, that was very pleasurable, but like, I have no meaning. Like, I don't know. I don't really feel like fulfilled. I don't feel, you know what I mean? Like, I didn't really have a purpose. I just did some stuff. And then was I able to in any way transcend like my basic instincts as a human being, as a Homo sapien? And like, failure to do so, failure to transcend those very primal instincts, maybe that is what in this day and age can cause a lack of meaning. Just throwing that out there. I don't know. But, looking ahead, will the advent of AI and robots, replacing humans in the workplace, do you think that's going to add more or less meaning to our lives? Do you think that's going to allow for the possibility of more meaning, or are we going to have even less to contribute to society? And if you think as a citizen, the less you're contributing to society, the more you're on your phone scrolling through TikTok or Instagram. That to me seems like, at least one interpretation is you're going down a less meaningful route. On the other hand, maybe you can say we'll have the time, maybe AI will free us up to pursue the arts, to pursue things that we really want to do, that can really transcend our, most basic instincts as human beings, and give us like this new layer of meaning. I don't know. What do you think?
I mean, I think that's kind of the greater question of, are we going to be in a tech utopia or not, with the integration of artificial intelligence and machine learning? And I think the answer to your question is largely dependent on how we structure our society going forward. Because if we keep things as they are, where, in our current economic arrangement, it's very profit driven, it's very extractive. Artificial deployed maybe less as and it is being deployed, because this is something that's really much happening right now. It's going to be deployed less as like of an augmentation to our work experience as opposed to a replacement. And let's say if we price out, I don't know, let's look at an industry that people talk a lot about. I think long haul trucking will be the one that's impacted pretty soon with autonomous driving and whatnot. And from what I remember, Andrew Yang's campaign in 2020 was very much focused on the logistics industry as one that is at risk of being automated out of existence, right? So if we change nothing else and all we do is insert AI and automation into a workforce and reduce the professional need for certain positions and certain individuals without having anything else change in our society to accommodate for that, that's not going to be a tech utopia. That's not going to be, 12, 20, I don't know how many truckers there are, like a couple 100,000 workers that are all of a sudden going to turn to the arts and poetry and ballet, because they're going to lose their source of income, and there isn't going to be anything else to sustain that. So in fact, I imagine there's going to be, let's say, I don't think that this is an awkward, I think, point to agree on, but let's say in this current day and age, our purpose is very much driven by our capacity to work and to contribute to the economy, even if we're not conscious of it. If you look at rates of depression in people who are out of work, who are stressed out by the job hunt for the need to return to the workforce, I think if you price out a lot of people out of their workplace by the introduction of robotics, it's going to in fact decrease the amount of purpose and meaning they might feel, because they will be out of the productive capacity. Now, let's say if our society evolves in tandem with that, right, where there is this kind of tech utopian ideal where machines will start doing the work for us so that we can actually focus on the humanities and the arts, and we have, let's say, free college programs or free education paths that individuals can take, again, in this case study from the logistics industry, maybe that is going to increase more meaning, right, where we can pursue higher ideals of composing symphonies, painting, maybe focusing on the sciences, exploration, studying our world.
What happens when AI composes more beautiful symphonies than humans, which is already to some extent happening.
Yeah, shit, man. I don't know. I've heard that AI Christmas Carol that was written by a computer. That's.
Have you seen? Okay, let's move on to like other art forms like images or painting.
Yeah.
Have you heard of Dolly? That AI?
I've read about it. I haven't seen any of its creation.
I was looking at them the other night, and the images that it formulates based off, you give it like a basic language input is astonishing.
Well, yeah, but that's
truly astonishing.
That's also getting into like the nature of what is creating art, right? Like, I mean, that's out of the immediate topic we're discussing, but even I imagine somebody who's painting. Even if their painting is absolute shit, it is a level of gratification you get from creating something, right? I mean, creating art isn't necessarily about the end product. And again, you're thinking with your damn capitalist mindset. But if I get into ceramics, I'm not going to be the best pottery maker in the world, but I'm going to be creating pottery, which is going to be a gratifying feeling. I took a block of clay, I spun it, I baked it, I painted it. That is my product. That, in fact, is leaving me with a gratified experience. So yeah, AI can do all these things. But the question is, we're still pursuing meaning in a certain sense, right? So if my meaning is making shitty pottery, it still brings me joy, it still brings me happiness, then maybe the realities of me losing my trucking job aren't going to be as harsh if I have something else to channel my interest into. And I think, the sciences, for instance, if you look at kind of the golden age of space exploration, where there's so much fascination with the universe and people were interested in taking astronomy courses and studying the heavens, think about how much we can learn about our own world, right? I mean, how many species of birds do you know in Kansas? I don't know any. And let's say if I had the time to stop and explore and learn about individual plants and how ecosystems work, that's all meaning in its own right. But again, to kind of circle back to your original point, I think that it's very much dependent on where our society goes, right? If we progress to a certain level where we can embrace AI and robotics and maybe take some of that profit and reinvest into our communities and our societies, I think there is a chance that we'll have higher levels of meaning, right? But if we're not going to do any of those sorts and kind of stick to this extractive path, I think we're actually headed towards, comparably speaking, a much more meaningless existence.
Yeah, it's difficult to speculate.
What do you think?
I'll speculate in a second, even though it's very difficult. But I think one thing I've read about meaning is that it's very tied to the narratives that we build, the narratives that we tell ourselves, the narratives that we find ourselves in our lives, whether that's a delusion or like a real objective narrative that's kind of unfolding. I think there's also something to be said about suffering. And there's a great book by Paul Bloom called The Sweet Spot, which shows the association of suffering with meaning, and how chosen suffering in your life can actually add immense amount of meaning to it. And the closer we get to, whether you want to say tech utopia or a dystopia, I think it's almost certain things will be easier in terms of our basic needs, right? Food, shelter, even sex. If you're gonna have sex robots,
right?
If you're gonna have, I don't know, some total recall
sensory experience
that you get into, and it simulates a sexual experience. Like, we're gonna get all our needs are going to be taken care of in a way that's going to be available, like at our fingertips. And it's going to be, because of the capitalistic system, which I believe we'll still be in, I think it's going to become very cheap to access those things. And so the ability to suffer is going to be it's going to get harder and harder to suffer, in a sense, right? To have like meaningful suffering in your life. And it's going to be harder to build a narrative, right? Like, what narrative will a young male have if they don't even have to pursue women? They don't have to pursue a family. They don't even have a desire to pursue a family because they're getting all their sexual fulfillment from a technological source, right? There's nothing to build because there's no desire even, right? Because your desires are taken care of in this tech utopia. So what do you do when you need a narrative to have a meaningful life? You need something, some sort of purpose, but your desire to even create that yourself is completely diminished by the availability, the cheap, easy access to all the things that will fulfill your kind of biological imperatives.
I feel like you're just describing what is it, Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. It's kind of the scenario that his kind of portrayal of a dystopian future is. But
yeah, maybe it was right.
But I don't know. I think that we're kind of dealing with this right now to a certain extent, where how much of a meaningful, I mean, if we're kind of, let's stick to the topic of like sexual relations, but how much of a meaningful experience do you get through technology? I mean, there is still very much the uncanny valley. Like, even, watching pornography, even if you have like the most like superior VR fleshlight combination, at the end of the day, you're not going to fool yourself into thinking that this is an actual genuine sexual experience, right? And there's like a stark difference between like jerking it to porn and having sex with a real partner. I don't know, like
I agree with you right now. I'm saying down the line, when it becomes more difficult to
kind of discern the two realities.
Those two realities. I mean, you could lack. I could still see people lacking meaning, although eventually even that could be addressed through, maybe technology addresses that through like some sort of virtual reality scenario where you enter this virtual reality, and that provides you the meaning through the narratives that are kind of
created by you yourself,
created by what you maybe just choose on a screen, or what the AI has decided is optimal for your personality type, and then imagine the narratives that will be created in that scenario, right? Even greater than anything you could possibly conceive of in real life. I mean, what does that do, right? Like, then you start asking yourself, what's the difference between this virtual reality and real life? And, if we were in a simulation, what's the difference, right, between that and if we were like really real, not simulated? I mean, like, at some point, like, it just becomes a mental cluster.
But what if that does give meaning, right? I mean, if you look at your original question, like, what gives life meaning today? What if my meaning is playing video games? I mean, I dabble occasionally. I'm not like really into video games, but like, what if I was like a really, really, really passionate gamer and I got a lot of joy out of really immersive, story-driven RPG games, right? And let's say my life is like a total wreck where, I don't have any friends. I don't have any real hobbies, quote unquote. My job sucks, but what if I derive a lot of joy and pleasure from this virtual experience that I know is a virtual experience, but I get what keeps me going is the prospect of, let's say I work to buy the newest console, to buy the newest version of a game, to buy the newest DLC. And I think maybe we tend to frown upon that as a society, right? Maybe we're a little bit more accepting towards like gaming culture nowadays, but my knee-jerk reaction is like, oh, that's an inherently meaningless existence. But if somebody derives joy from that, that's a path towards meaning to a certain extent. So maybe to take it to your scenario, if everything is digitized and you can have this fully immersive virtual experience to simulate friendship, to simulate sex, to simulate purpose, and it's fake, but you still get meaning from diving into that world, is that a meaningless experience? I don't think so. I think that could still be a level of meaning that you are bringing into your own life. Maybe not a traditional one. Maybe it's not building a house with your hands and foraging for food and slaughtering the bison you mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, but maybe that is like the future of it.
Well, I mean, you're bringing up the point that, meaning is inherently subjective. We haven't, maybe dug into as much as we should have early on. I think there are some objective features of meaning when it insofar as it relates to human beings,
right,
what human beings find a meaningful life. But, even if it's a delusional meaning, it still counts as long as you believe the delusion, right?
Mm-hmm.
The moment you step out of that delusion, maybe that's when it hits you that, oh shit, like me being plugged into this virtual reality, this is all like, if you were to really be immersed in it and kind of become one, with the self that you are in the virtual world, that's one thing. But will we ever be able to divorce ourselves from our instincts,
mm-hmm.
From our biological instincts and our awareness of like, oh, maybe this is not really real, right? Like this is fake. I'm kind of like, are we going to get intelligent enough to the point where that's a blocker to deluding ourselves, right? Because, I mean, to some extent, we as a species are built on delusion, right?
Yes.
There's a great book that I just almost finished reading called Denial, and it's about how human beings were able to kind of jump over the psychological barrier that a lot of other animals could not cross in terms of increasing in intelligence, right? Because if intelligence is a desirable trait for any given animal, if it has so much utility, then why don't we see more animals that are as intelligent as humans? Why didn't dolphins or elephants or other primates evolve to a level of similar or at least more intelligence, where they have sufficiently high level of theory of mind or whatever it is, and the barrier that kept apparently a lot of these other animals, at least what this author proposes, is the notion of death, becoming aware of your own mortality and what that does to evolution, right? You might be too scared to risk your life in doing so, or too scared to go find food because you're going to risk your life doing so, or psychologically collapse because you're like, holy shit, like what is even going on? I'm this being that exists in this crazy life. We found the ability to delude ourselves, to not really believe in death. I mean, even today, if you think about it, you don't really think about death too much. If that was on the forefront of your mind, it might really, I don't know, like it might really change your priorities, right?
Or it could be crippling.
It could be crippling. Yeah.
I think that, ironic, when I was younger, I used to think about death a lot. And it wasn't like an enlightening experience where I was like, oh, I could do anything. It was actually more numbing than anything, where I think it was paralyzing in a lot of my decision making when I was younger, that it was harder for me to make decisions and act on decisions because I had this like crippling fear of death and grappling with like what death even means, right? Yeah. And I know that that's a common frame of reference for maybe what our prehistoric ancestors derived meaning from, was this kind of like ever-present concept of death. But I don't know if that's like enough of a driving force, really. I think that even if we all had like a memento mori moment, that doesn't necessarily mean we would be living life to its fullest, living every day like it's your last. I mean, objectively speaking, I think there's a huge percentage of humanity, maybe it's like a psychological type, that when faced with death, you will not live out your greatest potential. You will cower, you will, hide in a corner, you'll try to avoid it. And we all want to think that we're going to be like the hero complex, right? That we're going to be the ones that when faced with death, we're going to appreciate as much of life as possible before we pass away. But I don't know. I mean, I think about people who are diagnosed with terminal illnesses. That doesn't necessarily always result in living life to its fullest, living life to, and sometimes it does.
Well, maybe because your realization of death is kind of, you are still in, even though you recognize it rationally, you're still in denial to some extent, and you create a delusion that prevents you from really saying, okay, if I'm going to die 6 months from now, like I need to live my life to the fullest. But if you've deluded yourself into not really taking that in on a level that affects your daily activities, if you've kind of suppressed this notion of death, then that would explain why you wouldn't take full advantage of your remaining time. And it just speaks to the level of delusion that humans can create for themselves, and what utility that may have. And you know, just to circle back to the original point about meaning, it really comes down to like, what is the human capacity to delude ourselves? Because if you wake up from the delusion that this video game that you're playing, or this virtual reality simulation that you're in, if that's fake, like if you let's say you actually woke up tomorrow and you were in a doctor's office, you're like, what the hell happened? You're like, oh, this is all like fake. Everything you've experienced has been a pure simulation. Like, do you want to get plugged back in, or, you know,
right.
do you want to enter the real world? Like, what would you, I don't know. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, how would you feel about that?
Well, I mean, I think that there'd be a lot of questions around what is the real world, like who are you in the real world, which in itself is a point of curiosity. I mean, yeah, it's a great point. I think that, you know, first of all, what a shitty simulation it was. Like, I simulated being in, you know, student debt and having to, like, it wasn't like orgies and eating grapes off the vine. It was just like, I have to stress about things. And, I mean, again, I think it's like that shit that Jordan Peterson always references, where, you know, everybody, when faced with the reality of the Holocaust, everybody would say that I would never participate in that. I would stand up to the Nazis, but it's, you know, realistically speaking, majority of people would probably fall in line and do whatever they had to do to get by. I think it's a kind of a similar frame of reference to the question of like being unplugged in the doctor's chair, right? Everybody would be like, no, I'm brave. I'm going to face what the reality is. But, you know, the simulation we're escaping is very comfortable because it's what we know, or at least what we've deceived ourselves into thinking that we know. Yeah, I don't know. But I mean, to your point of the death question is interesting to me, because I think that, you know, I disagree with these like assertions that fleeting things are beautiful, right? You know, this whole, again, like the memento mori, YOLO culture, right? That like, live your life once because life is short, life is beautiful. But I don't know. I think the fact that time is fleeting and everything's, that's kind of sad, right? And that's not...
It's sad if you come to grips with it in full and you view it in a more rational way. Yeah, it is, right? Everything's going to be... I mean, the whole universe eventually is going to suffer a heat death or a cold death or whatever, and nothing will have, right, ultimately mattered, because nothing's permanent.
Right.
Everything is futile. But on the other hand, if you can delude yourself, then YOLO is great. Like, I mean, why does something have to be permanent to be meaningful, right? Like, it could still have meaning. It's just still sad, I guess, is what you're saying. But
I think you actually ended up stumbling into the answer to the question of what is meaning. I think the meaning of life is to maximize your delusions. But really, I mean, it's to distract yourself enough from, even if you take away like the socioeconomic circumstances we're living in, kind of set that aside, but from the very real, very primal circumstances that we have, that we've always faced, right? You know, even to our ancestors, from your example of 50,000 years ago, there was always a delusion, right? The delusion that we are going to survive, and if I kill enough buffalo, I'll feed enough people, we're going to live a long time. That's a delusion, because inherently speaking, it's random. Everything is random. And our ancestors from all history have maintained a certain level of delusion. Maybe our delusion is a little bit more advanced now.
I like where you're going with this quite a bit, because it speaks to how you could have, like, let's say you have two scenarios, right? You have one, someone like Robin Williams, who is this, great actor, comedian, wealthy, etc. But he killed himself. Right?
Yeah.
And you think about, like, did he lack meaning in his life? Was he too aware of, like, what's this all for? You know what I'm saying? I mean, he could have had other issues. I actually don't know much about it.
Yeah, no.
but you could have this scenario where someone seems to be living an objectively more meaningful or happier life, and then you have the situation where you could have some dude in the Midwest working at an engineering firm who, by all accounts, is living an insanely boring life, going to the office, coming home, and then he just with his wife, they just kind of solve puzzles when he gets home, and they just walk around the neighborhood, and that's about it. That's about it. Pretty what most people would consider a mundane life, but he has a delusion when he goes into work that he's doing really important work. I mean, to some extent, engineering is important, but he feels like he's doing critical work. He feels like he's a genius. He's deluded himself into thinking like he's doing profound work, and he's super important to his community. Again, to some extent, these things are true if you're an engineer, but just run with the analogy or run with this hypothetical situation for a second. He's really given himself this grandiose delusion of what he's actually contributing to society, etc. And then he's also deluded himself into thinking his wife is the absolute, like, greatest woman, and this is also, like, I don't know, the person that he was destined to be with. This all, even if it's not objectively true, his delusions have created a level of meaning that gives him a much more fulfilling life than someone like maybe Robin Williams, or some very wealthy person who is all too aware of the realities of death, the reality of I don't know, just reality itself, like too aware of his own essence, of being an animal, of being just still one person in a society of 7-8 billion people, right? Like, there's this matter of interpretation of how you view yourself, and and the narrative or the delusion that you've created for yourself. And it could also be or you could have a negative delusion of reality, right? Like, you could say, oh, what's special about me? There's 8 billion of us on this planet. What's really special about my job? Anyone can do it. Like, why does any of this shit matter? Whatever. I'm just gonna, like, I don't know. Just gonna fucking, like, give up. I don't know. Like, that could also be argued to be some sort of negative delusion where, you're using subjective words and then, like, feeding into that story, right? Like, why is my life, why is it meaningful when there's 8 billion people and I'm doing it, like, how do I have any real value? Like, I'm just another, I don't know, pea in a pod.
But I mean, I think you're hitting on an amazing point here with this really good analogy you made of, like, the average Midwestern engineer. I think that maybe the one differentiating factor in terms of how we interpret meaning from past generations is maybe a lot more of our meaning is outsourced, and we see our meaning through the eyes of others, right? Where there's this constant notion of, like, what will the audience think? What will the external party think? This individual in your example is going to work in an engineering firm, and we perceive him as meaningless because you kind of describe this sort of, like, a very milquetoast sort of existence, down to, like, coming home from work and playing puzzles with his wife. And there is this, like, critical audience that maybe we perceive as constantly judging our actions. But what if that, average run-of-the-mill engineer doesn't give a fuck? What if he's not worried about being the most important person in the world or being the most talented person in the world? What if he's really happy to drive to his office, to spend some time with his colleagues, to, I don't know what engineers do, like bang out some spreadsheets. What if he gets a tremendous amount of meaning from driving his shitty ass Toyota Corolla that's paid off, that's reliable, and he gets to spend time with his wife who's not abusive, and they make puzzles together? Like, what if there is, in that normalcy that maybe in our in our world of social media and hyper awareness of everybody else, and kind of in this structured, very cleansed, orderly images that people produce through LinkedIn, what if that is the only like true path to, because you sort of establish the binary of meaning versus happiness?
Yeah, I mean, this is something like a lot of philosophers have touched on. This is also like kind of like the notion of like the hedonic treadmill, where the more you have, the more you want. Yeah. Right. And in the same way, if you can be happy with less, the richer you really are. Right. Right. And I mean, less you need. I mean, that's like really like kind of like the enlightenment that you would reach. Right.
Who was the Greek philosopher who like lived in a barrel and
I'm not
like
sure.
Shit in the street?
There's probably several. But you get what I'm saying here. I think some of that is down. It's hard to talk about these topics like in an abstract sense, because the truth is like there is this concrete reality of some of this is down to personality type. Some personalities are just okay with less, right? Right. Like if you're someone who also hasn't maybe been exposed to, maybe you're not on social media for whatever reason, all these different possibilities, right? If you've been exposed to less, if you have a personality type that's okay with less, you have probably an easier time finding a more meaningful and happy existence than someone who's incredibly driven, who's incredibly conscientious, who's incredibly dissatisfied with anything less than the absolute best for himself, who's incredibly curious and aware of all the different possibilities. That is almost a recipe for unhappiness, right? Mm-hmm. The more driven you are, the more you want, the more difficult it is to attain, and the more that you're going to want after you already attain. If you do manage to attain what you want, right? You get stuck in the hedonic treadmill. So I don't know, like, what do you, like, how do you divorce that though from human nature and the evolutionary purpose that sort of behavior serves, right? Because if you think about what evolution is about, it's not about your happiness. It's not about meaning. It is about simply reproduction, survival. Yeah. And if those tendencies make you unhappy, if they lead you to lead a less meaningful life, obviously evolution, we evolved under circumstances where you had meaning by virtue of completing tasks that were absolutely necessary for your survival. Now, you can, it doesn't have anything to really say about modern day society and like what's, it didn't evolve to make you miserable in the modern day society in terms of having no meaning because you've had your necessary biological imperatives fulfilled, right? Where was I going with this?
It was a good tangent. I think the most interesting thing in what you've discussed is that there isn't really a control group nowadays. I mean, maybe there is. Maybe that whole story of like Sentinel Island in the Indian Ocean, where they've been completely isolated from the rest of the world. Like they're still like very much on kind of like a tribal basis. They hunt with like bows and arrows. They shoot down drones every time like one flies over the island. They killed that missionary a couple of years back.
Deservedly so.
I mean, that guy is actually connected to our locality in an interesting way. We could talk about it later. But maybe that's the only like case study we have, like a control group, right? Because everybody's kind of living in the varying degrees of financial stability and whatnot, but we all kind of exist collectively in one like socioeconomic space. And I think maybe our interpretations of meaning are pretty aligned. There's different economic circumstances. Some countries are richer than others. You could talk about meaning and happiness to that extent, but largely speaking, most of us in the world are living in like a post-industrial civilization, right? Where we're not having to like hunt for food to survive, and we're not having to like fight off like wolves and shit from our, you know, caves to protect our family. So like everybody's kind of caught in this constant trap of like pursuing meaning and trying to establish meaning in this like world that we exist in, this time that we exist in, right? But there isn't really anything we could look at to be like, whoa, are they happier or are they sadder than we are, right? And maybe someday we'll be able to study like the Sentinelese Islanders and see how they perceive happiness or sadness or something like that. But I mean,
that would be fascinating. Yeah, that would absolutely be fascinating. I think, I mean, you know, if you go to like first principles, you know, if you think about things in terms of evolutionary frameworks, then you have to think that I mean, kind of something consistent with what we've discussed here, where they would definitely have a more meaningful life because every action that they take serves a greater purpose to their existence. Whereas crunching out numbers in Excel spreadsheets doesn't have that same connection, right? To like, oh, I've ensured the survival of my tribe for the next week by finding this invaluable resource in the jungle, right? But whether they're happier, you know, I don't know. If you ask them, like, do you want to, you know, have this medication that's going to save your life? Do you want to have unlimited food? Like, you know, to some extent, I mean, they probably would want to take that. But
yeah, I don't want to
really answer the question, like, are they happier in that scenario, right? Like,
do they have more meaning than us? And also, I imagine if you ask the question of a Sentinelese Islander, what is the meaning to life? I mean, the answer is probably markedly different from what somebody in, you know, a major metropolitan area in the United States would tell you. They would probably define it differently. Mm-hmm. And I don't want to like romanticize, you know, noble savagery or like whatever that concept is, you know, like the noble struggle of primal existence.
But no, I mean, it's very fair to ask the question of like, who's going to have a more meaningful life in that scenario, and even happiness. I mean, if you have a tight bond with all your tribe members, and every night you gather around the fire, you guys, you know, dance, tell stories, whatever. Like, I mean, is that could we say that is a more not just a meaningful but a happier life than, you know, happy until, you know, you get some disease and die, but like at least in some sense happier than the life of someone maybe who's just absolutely living in his New York, you know, in his Manhattan apartment by himself and like dragging himself to work barely every day, and then like, I don't know, eating fucking fast food. Or I mean, like, can you not say that that's a better life, even if it is riddled with much more suffering? And like we talked about, there's a connection between suffering and meaning.
Well, let me ask you this question. You know, we have a pretty large homeless crisis in our country. You know.
I thought you were going to say we have a pretty large audience.
Yes. I think we have 2 listeners. One of them is me, one of them is you. And your dad. We're good.
We had 14 downloads on the first episode.
Interesting.
I don't know from where, but
that's fucking crazy.
We've only
it's the FBI downloading our episodes. But what I was going to say is we have a fairly large homeless community here in our city. Sometimes, you know, we have big homeless encampments that we can see like on the sides of highways or at major intersections. Is that a happy existence? Is that a meaningful existence? Like, because you take away, you use the example of the dissatisfied schmuck sitting in his Manhattan apartment, which I imagine if he has an apartment in Manhattan, he's probably not doing too terrible. But, you know, in this schmuck living in this symbolic city, living in an apartment, going to work, coming home, he's in debt, he has to worry about medical bill, like all these things, right? In theory, being homeless, you take away all of those worries, right? It becomes very much...
Yeah, I mean that's only looking at it from a very narrow perspective, because, you know, part of human nature is also the tendency to compare yourself to others. And if you're homeless, you're at the bottom of society. And so
if you're choosing to internalize and define your life by the terms that society.
Unless you've created a very well-sealed delusion that you've chosen to be homeless. Very specifically, you could have been anything, but you chose to be homeless, and you created this
as a rejection of society.
If you created this grand illusion and you are totally sold on this, that's one thing.
Right.
But I think most homeless people are not necessarily homeless
by choice.
Okay,
fine. Let me take. Okay, next step from homeless, Amish. Maybe not.
Amish is a good example.
Right, because that is.
I almost said Hamish, by the way. Is that like the Arabic Amish people? Hamish?
We need to ask our Arabic friend, our one Arabic friend that we have. Who you know he's out of country.
Yeah. Who knows what he's doing?
I mean, we'll see. Hopefully, he gets back. So yeah. I don't know much. Fascinated by Amish lifestyles, especially here in the Midwest, and we have a lot of Amish communities in the area. But in essence, it is aside from the religious practice and the kind of the historical, cultural elements that the Amish community has, the roots, right? It is a rejection of certain modern day comforts or modern day necessities because of their interpretation of what, holy shit, drives meaning, right? You know, the reason why, I think from what I can tell, like certain Amish communities differ from others in terms of how conservative they are. But let's say we take the most conservative, most by the book Amish settlement, they most likely won't have smartphones. Maybe they'll have a truck, but they'll try to use, carriages and horses for as much transportation. But maybe what's a commonality is that they rely on themselves to build their homes, to raise as much of their own food. That's a different interpretation of meaning, If somebody, an Amish family is probably concerned with very similar things we're concerned with, if we have families to feed our children, to make sure they're raised in a certain stability and whatnot. But there is also a completely different path that's taken, right? Because there's less concern with social media, with maybe immediate material possessions, the latest pair of Yeezys and whatnot.
Yeah,
right?
and you could say maybe they don't really need social media when their socializing occurs in person in such a consistent manner because of the strong community that they have, right?
Right.
This also touches on, because the Amish are, they're religious, and so this kind of tackles the issue of the grandest of all delusions, right? Religion. So the level of delusion found in religion, you think about why religion has been so, prosperous in human societies and has been a part of human societies, even if it's not like a deity-based religion, but some form of supernatural beliefs about the afterlife or death, all these things that have such a strong, adherence to human culture since the advent of human culture. You have to wonder, okay, what's the utility of that, right? And as we discussed, the utility is, it could be multiple things, right? Like one is you don't think as much about your mortality or death. Like there's a strong utility in that. It allows you to be more focused on your day-to-day. There's also the utility in having a stronger community, having consistent beliefs among your, tribe members and all of those things. And also having a consistent belief system, it just reduces, the mental burden of dealing with all the questions of life, right? Again, it just goes back to the notion of being able to focus on the things that are actually most necessary for survival. Because you could spend your days thinking about why do I exist? Mm-hmm. What happens after I die? Mm-hmm. Holy shit, I'm going to die. And instead of pondering those questions, which have zero evolutionary utility, those are taken care of for you. You can do other things. Now, I think historically speaking, or anthropologically speaking, the greatest utility in religion is simply creating a strong community with consistent beliefs. I mean, that is just obvious advantages over a community that isn't as consistent in what they believe, doesn't have the same conviction in their beliefs. Also, you know, the notion of like there being an afterlife can allow for martyrs, and I mean, it's just, you know, the list of benefits are endless.
You know, but I also think that, you know, in our country, which maybe doesn't have as much support systems immediately provided by the government. Let's talk about maybe for the elderly, for instance, right? I was just listening to a podcast on the way here. It's kind of a historical podcast, but the banter beforehand, the two hosts, I think they're both Jewish, and they're talking about kind of the conflict they have with their parents. Their parents are more observant, they're not, you know, and they're, you know, discussing about fasting, and if they're going to be fasting or not. But one of the points that was made is that the host's mother, in her old age, became more religious, not because of a sense of impending death, but because the synagogue provided a consistent form of social interaction for somebody who can no longer drive, can no longer, you know, live an independent life for all intents and purposes, basically locked down in a house, right? But on a weekly basis, she can go to synagogue, she can participate in groups, she has people to talk to, she has people she knows consistently. So, you know, religion also, to your point, provides that level of community and engagement, and takes away from the loneliness, I think, that a lot of us experience in our day and age, right? And maybe that's what religion is. Even if you don't buy, you know, whatever's written in the book, you get to go and hang out with some people every week, you know? And maybe that is the utility of, you know, I think it's kind of a brief tangent, but I love reading about case studies where the influence of church has been abolished from certain states. For instance, in the 1930s, right before the Spanish Civil War kicked off, when the Spanish Republic came into power, you know, they won elections and they started dismantling a lot of the old monarchist traditions. One of the first things they got rid of is the influence in church and society. So they took the role out of church, out of education, out of, you know, civic organization. But all of a sudden, they realized that, you know, society became very, very, very fragile because the church provided a lot of the services and the systems that people needed to survive. You know, the government wasn't funding education, but all of a sudden the church stepped in and provided schooling. So what I'm saying is, I think maybe there are certain utilitarian things that religion brings to our lives.
No, absolutely it does. And this is, I think this is actually a topic I had in mind for another podcast. It was, how do we, as you know, as we're becoming a more secular society, how do we try to retain some of the benefits that religion provided without the delusion? Is that even possible? Mm-hmm. Right? And I think we can talk about this, you know, several hours. I mean, this is I think this is actually a very interesting issue, and one that, like, not many people are really discussing. Like, religion, you know, speaking of meaning, like, provided people with a lot of meaning in their lives as well. And as you become a more secular society, you know, atheism is not any really belief system, right? It's just, okay, I just don't believe in a God. That's not really a system of anything. That's just a lack of belief in an entity. And so, like, how did these more atheistic societies address this issue of meaning? And like, maybe we have to look at examples in Scandinavian countries where they're doing way better than religious countries, you know, in terms of their levels of happiness and meaning, right? So, like, there's clearly some ways we can mitigate the disadvantage of having a secular society, right? Because it's not just the pros of, like, oh, we're, you know, pro-science, we're you know, more free, we don't have these very coercive delusions about gender roles or whatever it is, right? That the negative, you know, the list of negatives to religion, you know, are at least as long as the list of positives that come from religion. But how do secular societies kind of address the void that religion leaves in society? That is something that, you know, the liberal hive mind that the liberals have not been able to really discuss, because it's very anti-religion, right? It's all about, well, really, they love to shit on Christianity, but not much is said about Islam, right?
Or Buddhism. Or Hinduism.
Right.
Scientology.
Scientology, well, that should be open game for everyone. but you get what I'm saying? Like there has been a lot of criticism of religion without really taking into consideration like what happens to societies when they aren't religious, when they don't have these grand delusions, right? Mm-hmm. Because as we've discussed, that seems to be, at least one way to achieve a more meaningful existence. And so taking away this source of meaning, well, you've got to counter that in some way. So that's something we should definitely discuss on another podcast. I do want to circle back to your point about the Amish people, though. You were talking about, well, not just the Amish people, but you were talking about, having a case study or a control group. Right? Yeah. And I was thinking back to, this was something we had discussed several months ago, but it was, back in the day when America was being conquered by the white people. And the Native Americans, there was obviously a lot of conflict back and forth between Native Americans and as the white people were moving more and more inland and, encountering the different tribes. They were talking about how some of the white people who were captured by the Native Americans, when they were released in like prisoner exchanges between the tribe and some whatever state or group or I don't know, whatever whatever fucking people. What were the people called in the? I mean, what were they called? Like the.
What people are you talking about?
The
man?
conquistadors.
Conquistadors.
Not the conquistadors, but like
just colonists.
The colonizers.
Yeah, colonists.
The colonists.
Yeah.
The colonists. Why was I unable?
The pilgrims, but that's that's limited to like one region. Yeah.
The colonists, right? The conflict between the Native Americans and the colonists.
Right.
Why were the colonists who were released in these prisoner exchanges from the Native American tribes, why were they wanting to go back to the Native American tribes?
Was it all of them, or was it just a couple? Like,
these, I don't know how verified these stories are, but this is something that was written down. I have to find the reference for this, but I'd be curious to know, like, what that...
Right.
What does that imply about the meaningful existence that the Native Americans had versus what the colonists?
And I mean, they're also coming from like a very rigid religious. I bet it kind of sucked to be a colonist on the North American continent in like the 17th century, right? You didn't know what the fuck you were doing. Half your people probably died. You're trying to figure out what roots to eat. It just sucks. And then all of a sudden you get captured by a tribe. They just hang out. They have some structure to their society. Their society is more permissible and forgiving, at least from like some of the tribes that were populating the eastern seaboard at the time, right? I think from what I've read, they're a little bit more egalitarian. Maybe it's just like an easier way of life, a more just way of life. There wasn't this kind of like constant like Christian Protestant guilt that you're always smacked with.
You make a good point though. Like, we're talking about people from a specific culture, in a very specific dynamic.
These were also English people, and right. English people are inherently self-loathing. There was a bunch of Italian colonizers, like they would have been chill.
Yeah. But it speaks to the complexity of social behavior, right?
Yeah.
And people shit on sociology as a field all the time because there's like this replication crisis with all the studies and whatnot, but the truth is, sociology is the most complicated, in my opinion, the most complicated field in all of science. because trying to understand and model and predict human behavior, not just like of a single individual, but multiple like groups of people and all the interactions that happen, not between the individuals, but also when you factor in like the culture itself, like this abstract layer of what is culture, right? Like that is way harder than say predicting what the weather's going to be, and we can't do that, beyond a couple of days accuracy, right? I mean, you can't even do that sometimes when it's going to rain in the evening.
Yeah, they fuck it up here all the time.
And that's that is a physical system, right? That is kind of like a fixed physical system where the parameters are easier to dissect. Okay, trying to dissect the parameters involved in social interactions. I mean, you would need some sort of insane AI with unbelievable computational power to even get anywhere near trying to predict human behavior.
I think we'd get really, we're going to be in trouble when the AI starts asking what the meaning of life is.
That is going to be terrifying.
Terrifying. We're almost there too. Rational thinking AI. I mean, just a couple of algorithms away.
Well, we have a hard time like perceiving or digesting exponential growth, right? I mean, AI could, like that scary AI could be it could be 10 years away. It may not seem like it because right now we're like, oh, okay, it's still so far away. They're still so stupid. They still can't do anything, but it could be closer than we think. I mean, that's the problem with exponential growth. Like, it's hard to anticipate.
And it's accumulating too, right?
Yeah.
The more data that's pumped into algorithms, the smarter these algorithms get. I think, but even like 5 years ago, everybody was making fun of what was like the Microsoft AI, like that started like
the Twitter
tweeting out like neo-Nazi bullshit. But I mean, even that's been, I imagine, refined to a certain extent now. That exponential growth is, I think, precisely as you described it. Like it's impossible for us to comprehend, and we do still think of things in like a linear level, at an incremental level. But the most important developments are happening right now with the coding and slow deployment and the continuous education of AI. I mean, if you're talking like in 5 years, we're going to have AI that's governing like the insurance market, for instance, right? That's going to be determining insurance policy rates based off of like random accumulations of data. That in itself is a pretty advanced step. Think about where in 10 years where it's going to get, right? So I'm telling you, Amish by 2030 is my trajectory.
Creating fake Amish societies where people have to pay to participate in for like a month. Great business idea.
We would get a lot of tech bros. Corporate retreats where you simulate an Amish way of life for a week.
Or better yet, you simulate maybe an old Native American
oh my
tribe, or you go back even farther. You simulate like a Stone Age human setting. Can you imagine?
I mean, I think that
you have to create your own stone tools. You have to hunt like, I don't know, they'll like put in some rabbits that run around. You have to hunt them.
It's basically just like an escape room. You just take it to the next level. With a few, with venture capital money, you could really turn this into, corporate team bonding experience.
Or like eventually you get to the point where it's like, it goes beyond that, where you have like more creative settings or environments like Hunger Games. I mean,
I think we are probably pretty close to watching interns fight to the death.
Interns?
Interns, yeah. You want to work at Google? Fucking prove it.
I think we end the podcast.
Yeah, that was good.
Yeah, that was good. I fucked up on the colonists part. I was like, what time period was this even? Was this like during the conquistadors? Or was
Seems like only yesterday.
It had to have been the colonists, but I didn't even know the right word.
Hey, you know,
I'm gonna clip that.
no, don't clip it because it shows like a naive tier of education that you have. Like you totally like pinpointed like Native American tribes, and then like the colonizers is what you fucked up. You did like a reverse like Western supremacy. So if anything, you showed honor to the true inheritors of this land.
That is true. That is true. That is quite a delusion that you have there.
Man, I'm swimming in delusions.
Oh shit, we haven't stopped.
Anyways, thank you for joining us. We look forward to talking to you again in the future. Ivan, any final words?
That's all, folks.
Zing!